former President Donald Trump did the most Trumpian thing I think I've ever seen, which is he released a statement on Colin Powell's passing. And it's just chef's kiss, created in a lab to be more Trumpy than Trump. And of course, the media's flipping out over it and focusing on it and talking about it nonstop. So here is, you're gonna see the statement he released. Jake Tapper is going to read it to you on CNN. But what I'm actually more interested in, I'll talk about his statement, but what I'm more interested in is the reaction here, because I think it really highlights one of the main pathologies of elite media and how we got where we are now.
While we're on the topic of Donald Trump, let's just remind people who Republicans are lining up behind, Republican office holders. He just released a statement about the death of General Colin Powell, who died. We should say he was fighting cancer and Parkinson's, but his death was something of a surprise. He and his wife, Alma, although they were both vaccinated, tested positive for COVID, and Alma's okay, but Colin Powell regrettably died because he had these problems with underlying conditions and a compromised immune system. That said, here is what Donald Trump had to say about this decorated, trailblazing Vietnam War veteran and general. Quote, "Wonderful to see Colin Powell, who made big mistakes on Iraq and famously so-called weapons of mass destruction, be treated in death so beautifully by the fake news media. Hope that happens to me someday. He was a classic rhino, Republican in name only, if even that, always being the first to attack other Republicans. He made plenty of mistakes. But anyway, may he rest in peace." And that was immediately followed by a link to donate money to Donald Trump. It's hardly the first time that Trump has acted this way. He did it to John Dingell. He did it to John McCain. It's still shocking that Republicans are lined up behind this guy.
It is still shocking. And, you know, at the end of the day, these statements over and over again, it all comes back to himself. He points to himself and the fake news media over and over again. And it is still equally shocking. And I guess we shouldn't really expect Republicans at this point to really criticize him over something like this. But, you know, Liz Cheney and I think a few others did come out, but I think we're not going to see top Republicans.
Is this shocking, though?
It.
Because I don't think anything about this is shocking. I mean, Colin Powell...
Shocking, but not surprising.
Yeah.
That's how I...
I mean, Colin Powell is someone who dedicated his entire life to serving others. Donald Trump is someone who has dedicated his life to serving himself. I mean, Colin Powell was the first black chief of staff. Donald Trump is the first twice impeached president. I mean, I don't want to attack Donald Trump personally because that takes it down to his level, but he talked about being remembered. He will be remembered as one of the most graceless people who has ever graced this country. Colin Powell is anything but.
And it's actually a political gift for Democrats. Every time he does this, he reminds people who revolted from the Republican Party, the suburban, the educated, the women voters who used to be so important to our coalition, who now have run very far away. Every time he does this, every time he invokes racial undertones of some of his statements, they go further and further away. So I'm sure, you know, while Democrats are upset that he did this, it's also, once again, another gift.
It is a gift.
Yeah, so here's my hot take. I don't think it's a gift to Democrats. I don't think anybody really cares. And I think that a lot of the outrage here is performative. So, this is what Trump did last time. He would say something that's like hilariously crass, and then the media would melt down over it. But what does his statement say? "Wonderful to see Colin Powell, who made big mistakes on Iraq and famously so-called weapons of mass destruction, be treated in death so beautifully by the fake news media. Hope that happens to me someday. He was a classic rhino, if even that, always being the first to attack other Republicans. He made plenty of mistakes, but anyway, may he rest in peace." So the core of what he said there is he made big mistakes on Iraq. I love the, but anyway, rest in peace. He made big mistakes on Iraq. I think that, if anything, that's being overly kind. Mistake on Iraq and weapons of mass destruction. And the fake news media is treating him so beautifully. By the way, Donald, the media will give you this treatment if you learn how to shut the fuck up and move on. Because in the year 2048, when President Carrot Top nukes Venezuela, they'll be talking about, can we just return to the good old days of Trump where we had Republicans who were, maybe we didn't agree with them, but they were a lot more reasonable. And how do I know that? That's what happened with George W. Bush. George W. Bush was probably a worse president than Donald Trump, and he's totally rehabilitated even in elite liberal circles. Why? Because they compared Trump to him, and they were like, oh, Trump is more, crass and has no filter and shoots from the hip and disrespects everybody, so that violates civility and decorum, so we don't like it. So yeah, in the future, you have a Republican president who's even crazier, and says more ridiculous shit, and they will rehabilitate you, but you got to learn to shut the fuck up. Anyway, I digress from that point. The Iraq point from Trump is true, and if anything, it's actually too soft. Oh, he made big mistakes on her. It wasn't a mistake. Colin Powell knew that the Bush administration, that Cheney and Rumsfeld and George W. Bush wanted to go to war with Iraq. He also knew there was no good reason to go to war with Iraq. But he made the case anyway, and if it wasn't for him, because he had credibility in the media, so he went out there and made the case at the UN and held up the vial, the fake evidence, and said, well, what are we going to do? We got to do what we got to do. We got to go to war. So he knew it was wrong because he argued behind the scenes against it, but he did it anyway. And so effectively, his worldview and his philosophy came down to, even if I disagree with it, if the boss says it, I have to do it. Well, guys, that's the exact issue that comes up in international law and at the Nuremberg Tribunal. This idea that, hey, I'm just following orders. Okay, well, when you just followed orders, it led to the death of minimum 200,000 innocent civilians in Iraq. Some estimates have over 1 million. So that's what happened when you just followed orders. When people just followed orders, we did torture that was copied from communist Chinese, manuals on how to torture. That's just following orders. Just following orders broke an entire region of the world and led to the rise of ISIS. That's what just following orders. By the way, it's a theme throughout Colin Powell's career. He was also in Vietnam. Vietnam is quintessential. Hey, we're just following orders. Another illegal and offensive war, destroying a region of the world, massacring landless peasants, using Agent Orange and napalm. I'm just following orders. So, in the framework of the morality of empire, that's viewed as a moral good and viewed as a necessity. You got to be the good soldier. You got to follow orders and do as you're told, even if the person at the top making the decisions, totally insane, neoconservative, imperialist war hawks, who, if they had their way, would forcibly, effectively take over the world and put everybody under some sort of corporate authoritarianism. So he's no hero. In fact, if you look at the things people are celebrating him for, and you heard the commentator that, he had so much grace, something Trump doesn't have. What, because he was polite when he spoke? We're supposed to overlook the rest of his crimes? What if Goebbels was a gentleman? Is it like, well, he's a nice guy, so he had a lot of grace, so that other stuff he did, meh? No. That's not the way we evaluate stuff. That's not the way adults evaluate stuff. What happens is, only if you're in the club of the imperialists in the U.S. are you given the leeway of people saying, you meant well, but you messed up. Do we ever grant that to, the Iranian government or the Venezuelan government? No, it's portrayed as almost a caricature of a cartoon villain. Like, they're all evil, and they can't wait to do more evil, and it's in the nature of who they are. Whereas on our side, the nature of who our leaders are is good gentlemen. And if they do something wrong, it's just a mistake for which we can overlook because, hey, they're really polite and graceful. No. And by the way, they might be upset he's calling Colin Powell a rhino too. Well, Colin Powell did, at the end, flip parties. And he stayed a Republican but voted for Obama in 2008. And I think he actually left the Republican Party when January 6th happened, and he supported Biden too. So to say Republican in name only, Colin Powell will probably say that at a certain point I was a Republican in name only. You know what I mean? But, that would be a better part of his life. You know what I mean? But Trump's, of course, portraying it as a negative thing. But this is Trump being Trump, and it's hilariously crass. But there is a grain of truth, even though, if anything, he's too soft on Colin Powell. There's a grain of truth in this, and the media flipped out over it. And the media is acting like, this is the worst aspect of Trump. No! The worst aspects of Trump are what? That he increased drone strikes 432% and massacred an insane number of civilians. That we had the highest death toll we had in Afghanistan throughout the entire war in the year 2018 or 2019 when Trump was leading it. He said he was going to get out. He didn't get out. If anything, he increased the bombing campaign and killed more civilians. That we were still in Iraq under Donald Trump. That we're occupying Syria and jacking their oil under Donald Trump. That he totally destroyed the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which is a bureau that returned billions of dollars to defrauded Americans. And he destroyed it on behalf of industry. The predatory payday loan industry gave him millions of dollars or $1 million for his inauguration, and then he turned around and dropped the new regulations against them and dropped the lawsuits against them. That his biggest legislative accomplishment was a tax cut bill where 83% of the benefits went to the top 1%. The biggest problem with Donald Trump is that he's just like George Bush in many respects, is that he's a standard establishment Republican. But see, the argument from CNN is, we wish he was just a standard establishment Republican, but he's not. He's just so crass and impolite, and his violation of civility and decorum is what makes him uniquely bad. And I think that that's the reason why the attacks from mainstream media don't land on Trump. And by the way, what's my evidence of that? 2015 and 2016, when he was running, this was the nature of all the attacks against Donald Trump when he ran for president in 2016, and then he won. So what does that tell you? The ways in which you're attacking him are not resonating. You want to know why? Because most Americans really don't give a shit about the elites in the club. Most Americans probably don't know almost anything about Colin Powell in the first place. But, you know, to defend the honor of Colin Powell or Hillary Clinton or John McCain and how dare you, sir? You're not going to, how dare you, sir, into defeating this guy. You're not going to do it. So that's the problem with elite media, is that all they know how to do is circle the wagons and protect other elites. And that's not a poignant or potent way to take down a high-level charlatan and demagogue and con man, which is exactly what Trump is. No matter how much pearl clutching you do, it's not going to make people go, I'm on your side. If anything, the pearl clutching is fucking annoying. Now, of course, Donald Trump is crass as hell and incredibly narcissistic, phenomenally narcissistic. But when he says something with a grain of truth in it, you can't save your most passionate outrage for that. It's just, it says a lot about elite media. The statement says what about Donald Trump, what we already knew about Donald Trump. He's incredibly crass. He's a psychopathic narcissist. He does make other people's death about him, of course. And all that stuff is gross. It's also gross when the media can't help themselves, but at all costs defend other elites. Even when some of the criticism of the other elites is totally accurate, if anything, too soft. So that's my take on that. You really needed to be outraged at the right things with Trump, and there's a million things to be outraged by, the correct things. But they weren't outraged by any of the right things. They were only outraged by the wrong things. And that's why the more they attack him, the more he either went up in the polls or stayed the same. Their attacks didn't land because they don't have their finger on the pulse. They have their finger on the pulse of other elites. And that's it. But the number of elites, by definition, is pretty small. And so they're like, this is a gift to Democrats. No, it's not. First of all, nobody's going to remember this. Second of all, most Americans don't know anything about Colin Powell. Third of all, you're just doing pearl-clutching performative outrage. If anything, people just get annoyed at pearl-clutching performative outrage. And so that's my guess as to how this will play out. You know, within DC circles, they'll be like, oh, Trump said something unconscionable, and Colin Powell was a hero. But among regular people, they're like, I can't pay my hospital bill. You going to help me with that? Or are you going to keep bitching about protecting some other elitist douchebag I know nothing about? That's my guess.